In the sociology of philosophies, I traced the careers and networks of 3,000 philosophers and mathematicians from all the major world civilizations from about 500 BC to 1950 AD. These are my main conclusions. Major philosophers never appear alone. There are always two or three or slightly more in the same place and the same generation, which is to say, you never get just one. There are many generations when you don't have any at all. The most important philosophers are connected to each other in two dimensions, vertically across generations, from mentors to pupils or proteges, and horizontally among acquaintances, friends, and rivals. Often they begin as a small clique of rebels against the older generation, then split apart into rival positions once they achieve fame. So we have on the screen the European network at the turn of the 20th century. In this simplified version of the network, we see that Wittgenstein is a pupil of both Russell and Frege, and I omitted this in the network, but he was in very close contact with G.E. Moore, and hence with the origins of ordinary language philosophy as well. And Wittgenstein shares the same teacher, Frege, with Carnap. Surprisingly, Carnap has a neo-Kantian teacher in common with Heidegger, who is also taught by Husserl. Husserl, in turn, is only a few links from the mathematicians preceding the Vienna Circle. The two major opposing schools branch off from the same point. Wittgenstein and Heidegger are network cousins, so to speak. What can we infer from these network patterns about the process of creativity? What is it that the younger generation learns from master-pupil chains? It cannot be simply imitation, since creativity means doing something new. Great thinkers have many pupils, but the ones who loyally repeat their teachers do not become famous in their own right. Close contact with the creators of the previous generation is the way to acquire their methods of being innovative, not so much specific ideas as their way of positioning oneself in the field so as to do something distinctive. Creativity is a process of recombining concepts to find new combinations, such as those that we see as the networks get recombined by in the generation of Wittgenstein, Carnap, Heidegger, and Husserl. Newcomers who become creative internalize a sense of the field. Concepts and the persons who create them become synonymous in their minds. The sense of who are one's allies and one's enemies becomes automatic. Such persons think and create faster than others. They appear to think intuitively, but this is not a lifelong individual attribute. It arises by experience in the centers of creative networks. The same process happens in horizontal circles of young Turks, as we used to call them, rebelling together. Intense discussions and arguments within the group produce a strong sense of where the action is and what are the new niches that can be created in moving beyond what has already been done. The Vienna Circle is another such example. Do these patterns apply to all fields of creativity? Yes, with some exceptions. I find that the network pattern does apply to painters very much as it does among philosophers, but novelists are different. This has to be shown empirically for each field. I'm now applying the network method to music composers in Europe from 1600 to 1930. So can we get the German network, please? We will look at two of the networks, the German-speaking area from 1700 to 1900 and Russia from 1830 to 1930. There are also networks for Italy, France, and elsewhere that I will not discuss. My method is to assemble a large number of names of musicians. Those in large capitals are major, such as Handel near the top of the screen. Small capitals are secondary, such as CPE Bach, and small print are minor, such as Pachelbel, who you see is the teacher of Johann Sebastian Bach's teacher. Rank in my method is based on their long-term reputation, which I measure by number of performances and recordings of their music, music scores for piano, and the amount that's been written about them. I've checked their biographies looking for details of who they took lessons from or worked with as an apprentice or accompanist. These networks are linked with a one-directional arrow. Network lines without arrows indicate persons who are friends and acquaintances. I limit these contacts in the network diagram to those which happen early in the younger musician's career, preceding their major creativity. Lines with arrows at both ends indicate rivals, such as the famous rivalry between Wagner and Brahms, which you can see down near the lower part. Links consisting of double lines indicate collaboration. Those persons both worked on producing the same composition. The major composers are linked to each other both vertically and horizontally. Many are direct contacts. Some are mediated by secondary or minor figures in a two-link connection. Johann Sebastian Bach is connected to Mozart downstream via two of his sons, including the secondary figure, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who for a time was more famous than his father. Mozart and Haydn, working at the same time, are acquaintances who exchange extensive mutual influences. Beethoven is a pupil of Haydn and possibly of Mozart. Also very important is the mediating link, Baron von Swieten, the main music patron in Vienna. He was the early patron of both Mozart and Beethoven. Von Swieten, who had known C.P.E. Bach in Berlin, also revived the elder Bach's music and propagated the idea that some music is perennial classics, not just ephemeral music for the present occasion, and that some composers are living classics in our midst. Beethoven was the first to benefit from this new status. Mozart came a little too early. Via direct or two-link connections, we can trace the networks of important composers for 8 generations, from Bach and Handel down to Schoenberg and John Cage. Patrons are an important part of the network. Haydn began his career as an accompanist to a traveling opera singer, thereby learning the current repertory. He then became the house composer for the palace orchestra of Prince Esterhazy. It is just the time when the orchestra in the modern sense was being developed, with a large number of string instruments and other instruments. And at the time of the shift from polyphonic counterpoint, which is characteristic of Bach and Handel, to homophonic compositions, which is to say, the melody line of supporting chords, which is familiar to us in both classical and popular music down to the present day. Haydn was the first to have the opportunity to experiment with the melody and chord style and with his own orchestra. And thus he was able to lay down the chief forms of orchestral music, still popular to the present time. Liszt's father was a musician in the same orchestra, and the Esterhazy family sponsored the early training of Franz Liszt, who became the first big pop star in the era when the modern piano spread into middle-class households, resulting in a big outburst of amateur music fans. I will note 2 more ways of launching a career. Schubert struggled in poverty, but besides some lessons from Mozart's enemy, Salieri, Schubert had the great advantage of being a choir singer in a school in Vienna that had its own student orchestra. This enabled Schubert, when still in his teens, to learn the scores of Mozart and Beethoven by conducting them. Schubert also could use his orchestra to try out symphonies of his own. The earliest ones were imitative, but the later ones were his own distinctive blend. Wagner, who we'll see in the lower right side of the screen, illustrates another way to acquire a network link that launches one's creative fame. Wagner's early career is in a theater family without direct connections to important musicians. His early compositions are unsuccessful until he reaches Paris around 1840, where he has contact with a conventional opera composer, Meyerbeer. More importantly, Wagner has to eke out a living working for publishers by writing out orchestral parts for composers like Donizetti. Wagner generates a revolution in opera by reacting against the operatic style in which the solo singer is the center and all the rest of the instruments are background. Wagner reverses the formula. For Wagner, the orchestra carries the musical themes and the singers provide the accent marks. This is creativity by negation. Wagner reverses one key element in the traditional style while keeping other techniques such as chordal harmonies. This is similar to the development of non-Euclidean geometries by rejecting the parallel lines postulate and then reworking the rest of traditional geometry on the new basis. This became a technique of innovation in mathematics, such as creating non-commutative algebras, and then a variety of non-Euclidean geometries once the pathway to innovation was opened. This method of axiomatizing and then reorganizing the philosophical field was taken up by Wittgenstein 2 generations later, after Russell and Whitehead attempted it in the Foundations of Mathematics. Wagner learned his technique and formulated his distinctive style by several years of grinding work at the heart of the opposing camp. Knowing the techniques of your enemies in detail is the crucial resource for those who want to establish a new direction. Reading and copying music scores gives a strong sense of how existing music is put together and how it can be done differently. Let's turn now to the Russian network. The most prominent pattern here is the group of young Turks, the young composers who set out to create a distinctively Russian national music. They were famously called the Mighty Five or Mighty Handful because they were featured in an early concert together, but only four of them are important. Balakirev, near the upper left, just above Mussorgsky, was the first. The first to bring European techniques of orchestral composition into Russia in the 1850s and 60s. His network comes from several Russians who had gone to Germany and France. Glinka, who introduced opera into Russia, and the Rubinstein brothers, who founded music conservatories at St. Petersburg and Moscow. The network connections, which we see in the upper left and upper right, are to European composers Donizetti and Berlioz on one side, and Chopin and Liszt on the other. In other words, the major composers of that second generation of the 19th century. The great Russian composers had to learn their orchestral techniques for themselves, since none of them attended conservatories, which did not yet exist. They all come from families of rich landowners, and they attend government schools for officials and military officers. Two of the most important, Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, are the first professors of composition at the Moscow and St. Petersburg conservatories. Notably, they got their posts before they composed anything important. They had to learn on the job. Both of them published books on orchestration, creating the lush Russian sound of full instrumentation, going beyond the string-dominated European orchestras. In effect, the Russians had a musical version of the advantage of comparative backwardness, jumping over the formative generations of European music into the late 19th century phase when the classic melody plus chords formula was being transcended. The most radical of the Russian composers, Mussorgsky, was rather like a hippie, full of radical ideas at the time of the freeing of the serfs, living in a commune, drinking heavily. He composes a nationalist Russian opera, Boris Godunov, full of the sounds of monks' chants and booming church bells. He has trouble getting it produced. At first, Mussorgsky does not know enough about opera to have a part for a soprano. Rimsky-Korsakov becomes the mentor to the rest of the group, helping the others with orchestration. Boris Godunov becomes known to the world in a posthumous version reworked by Rimsky-Korsakov, who also helped with his other famous works, the orchestration of The Night of Bald Mountain and his unfinished opera, Kovanchina. So you'll see the parallel lines between Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Stravinsky, etc. on the left-hand side shows that there's a great deal of collaborating and reworking each other's scores. And this continued for 2 generations, with the exception of Tchaikovsky, who I will discuss in a minute. Russian music was unknown to the world until Diaghilev produced Boris Godunov in 1907 in Paris, and then the Ballet Russe between 1909 and 1913, introducing the work of Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, and above all Mussorgsky to the Western world. Debussy and other modernist composers collaborated with Stravinsky in the Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of Spring, that caused a sensation and a riot on its debut in 1913. Another French modernist, Ravel, orchestrated Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which originally existed only in a piano version. The mighty handful became a movement stretching across 2 generations, with a self-conscious program to create a distinctively non-Western music, initially Russian nationalist, but soon it became the leading edge of modernist music. Against all this, Tchaikovsky was a holdout. In the network, we see the heavy 2-handed arrow between him and Mussorgsky. They criticized and indeed insulted each other's music. Tchaikovsky continued to hold to the European path, lush romantic music, with full touches of Russian orchestration, but still in the melody and chord tradition. He also creates the modern ballet repertoire, which had been stifled in old forms. Tchaikovsky was the one important Russian composer who had good contacts during the West during his career. He traveled widely in Europe in the 1880s, conducting his own works, meeting von Bülow in the Wagner network, and bringing back the latest European techniques to Russia. He and Mussorgsky had opposing niches. Here we see that niches in the music world are not merely vertical, not just the old generation against the new, but opposing ways to innovate. Tchaikovsky's niche is continued by his protege Rachmaninoff, who also had network links to Rimsky-Korsakov and to the virtuoso pianist Franz Liszt. The resulting combination in Rachmaninoff brings together spectacular piano technique, beautiful romantic melodies, and lush orchestration with overtones of Russian church bells. To summarize, can we go back to the German network, please? Good. The networks contain more musicians than innovators. I've left out many of the minor figures, for the purpose of this presentation. Many musicians imitate their masters. We can see here that Beethoven has many pupils, but chiefly they are flashy piano players rather than innovators. I've argued that creativity begins by internalizing a sense of the field, of what has already been done and who are the rival positions. Mozart had a tremendous memory for music that he heard. He got this from so many sources, as his father paraded the child around Europe, that he was able to blend many elements into his distinctively fluid style. And persons who internalize the field and sense the combinations can compose swiftly. They develop huge emotional energy, the sense of initiative and trajectory that enables them to produce large amounts of new work. I would say, by the way, I very much dislike the concept of genius, which reifies something which is an emergent process. What we call genius is somebody who has internalized the field well enough so that they almost automatically see what combinations belong to who and where I can fit my own. Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven are all energy demons, workaholics, one might say, except the modern cliche does not capture the delight they feel in their work. And innovators tend to be closely tied to innovations in instruments. Johann Sebastian Bach began his career as a teenager repairing and building organs, becoming a virtuoso of what could be played on the big new instruments with both hands and feet. The massive organ is perfected at just in the generation of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he develops that style which he will now transpose into his other works. Beethoven, also spent much time since his early youth with piano makers, pushing them to develop the pianos to become stronger, louder, and more resonant. This enabled him to create his distinctive brand of dramatic music, first on the piano, which he later transferred to his symphonies. Musicians, like laboratory scientists, develop in a hybrid network of humans and their instruments, experimenting with the technical possibilities to find what can be discovered, in this case, in the realm of sound. Let me close now with an example of innovative technique in the career of René Descartes. Medieval mathematicians understood many of the concepts and operations of algebra, but they had to work them out verbally. Some abbreviations were developed, but solving a problem was still mind fatiguing until Descartes mechanized the process. He set up basic procedures, organized every mathematical statement of knowns and unknowns by lining them up to the left and the right of an equal sign. If more than one equation applies, line them up one above the other. Rearrange the terms by performing the same operation, such as adding or multiplying, providing you do it to both sides of the equation. Substitute terms from one equation into the other until we get an equation for the term we're looking for. Rearranging the equations on paper becomes a mechanical process. Today, any school child can do what the greatest minds before Descartes found difficult, and it opened up a path to seeking new techniques in mathematics. Descartes did it himself by applying just this type of technique to geometry, and then went on to apply the axiomatic method to philosophy. Sophistication in math and philosophy come with the recognition that innovations in technique are the path to further discoveries. This also happens in music. Unlike amateurs who merely enjoy the music, creative composers look for techniques that have previously used in their networks and construct new music by innovating in technique. Similarly, creativity in philosophy comes from acquiring the techniques, or should we say the meta techniques, of constructing new philosophies. Thanks for your attention.